As an assistant professor and researcher at OARDC, Dr. Ben Enger specializes in mastitis and mammary physiology, and he's here to give you a little more insight on what he does and what you could expect from him on November 14th at Dairy Day, brought to you by Krauss Dairy and CFAES at The Ohio State University. Since you've been in a lot of different regions, Washington, Idaho, Virginia Tech, I know that's where you were before here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what did you kind of notice about, the differences in production between the regions? Or like you said, obviously just the living situation was a lot different, but just different things like that kind of helped you throughout the way and kind of help with your research a little bit more, a little bit more broad.
Yeah, so the advantage for me of living in all these different places and seeing dairy in different lights throughout the U.S. gave me a little bit of a perspective of understanding that not everywhere is the same. They are all trying to achieve the same goal, which is produce milk, but they're going to all have their own unique challenges associated with them. So, for example, out in Idaho, where it's pretty dry, environmental mastitis is not the same issue it is out here.
Okay.
So contagious mastitis is usually the focus point out there relative to here. And so there's just little things like that. In general, I'd say most of the farms out west that I've been exposed to are quite a bit larger than what they are out east. But it's just different systems. And part of that is due to the age of the facilities out there. When you consider how relatively newly established those dairy facilities are compared to the several hundred-year-old farms that are here, it obviously would make a lot of sense that they wouldn't be as new and updated relative to there. And so the one thing I kind of describe to some people is if you're on these large dairies, they're there to make money, and they're really interested in investing in whatever is going to help them do their job better.
Okay. Whereas you feel like more around like our area where we're at here, it's more of kind of you grew up doing that thing and you want to take over the family business, whereas out there it's more of just a business in a sense.
Yeah, so it's a mixture of both. Most all the dairy farms I've ever been on are still family owned and operated. It's just the scale and size of them that is really different, and that changes how they'll manage things. So if you have these folks that are running these family farms that are several thousand cows, they're not going to be out there in the milking parlor milking those animals. They're going to be instead in a more managerial position, focusing on how do I manage the people and empower them to do the stuff that I need them to do. Whereas here, you're going to be the jack of all trades and hopefully the master of all of them too, so you can best achieve whatever your goals are for that season. Same with putting up forage for the winter. I mean, it's the same issues in both places. At least out west, you didn't have to deal with as much rain. So you had a little bit better control over there, but you also had to pay for irrigation, and that is not something that you see here whatsoever. No irrigation.
I think the first time I ever saw irrigation was when I lived in Colorado, and we were driving through. I was going to a friend's house, and all of those, and it's not something you see in Ohio very often. I also read that you grew up raising swine, correct?
Yeah.
So is that more on a commercial standpoint, or is it show stuff?
That was just show stuff. So I actually really enjoyed that. Had a lot of fun doing that as a kid. And I could give a pig a real mean haircut. I'm pretty good at showing animals. But after I got out of high school and went off to college, didn't really have the facilities to do anything like that anymore. And so then I kind of changed interests and was thinking about going into meat science, and then stumbled into dairy, and ever since then it's stuck.
Well, that's cool. So this might seem kind of weird, I guess. So actually my fiance is very big into the pig business, and then I'm obviously in the dairy side of things. So with pigs nursing and all of that, pigs obviously could get mastitis. Is that something that, have you done anything with that at all, whether or not it's more prominent in certain facilities or anything like that?
So pigs can get mastitis just like any other mammal can. And from what I understand, it's relatively common. The reason is we don't focus very much on them is because pigs are more difficult to work with, and it's more difficult to understand which gland is really influencing which one's going on there. But it is really well established that pigs get mastitis, and that milk production is a limiting factor when it comes to weaning weight. So any way to increase milk production in pigs is going to have positive influences on litter health and weight.
Yeah, that's just not something you ever hear about. I mean, obviously, you talk about mastitis and dairy cattle all day long, but you don't really hear about it in the other animals.
It's a little hard to milk out a pig too.
That'd be a fun project to do, though.
Fun's a relative term.
So, in your opinion, what are the biggest challenges that dairy producers just all over, so broad range, or if you want to keep it to local where you're kind of working a little bit more, but just some of the biggest issues that they're facing and, any ideas that you have to kind of combat those?
One of the biggest things that I do not envy dairy producers whatsoever for is trying to find the balance point between managing the animals and also managing the checkbook. Yeah. And that's something that dairy farmers do extraordinarily well, but it is something that they also have to keep on top of. And balancing all that with whatever your goals of your specific farm may be is definitely a challenge. Coming back to udder health, the areas that I focus on quite a bit that I think are areas for improvement would be actually managing heifers before they come in. So most people don't think of heifers getting mastitis or having infections, but about 40% of all the quarters are going to be infected before that animal ever starts producing milk.
Really?
And so that's the area I spend a lot of time focusing on. But more or less, I guess, just paying attention to every single animal on the farm, not just calves and not just milk cows, kind of considering the spectrum and realizing that if you manage a certain group well, later on, they're going to pay off in the long run.
That's a really good point, because I mean, even out at our farm right now, that's kind of where we're at. We obviously look at calves. I mean, we look at everything every day, but you spend a lot more time just with the calves and just with the milking herd, whereas heifers, it's just checking to see if they're in heat and then cleaning their pens and then checking once they're bred to see if they need to move down to the dry pen or anything. Yes, that's really interesting.
Yeah, and with the changes in how dairy systems have adapted, there might be some more opportunity to more intensely manage those animals. So, for example, I was discussing this with some folks yesterday. If we're going to be trying to manage bred heifers better, you got to have the facilities to complement something like that. And so where do you find those? And actually, heifer rearers may have those specialized facilities better than any milk producing farm. So having that, let's say, division of labor and specialization might be beneficial in the future.
Contract it out almost and have somebody that just does that one part of it.
Yeah.
I think that is something. I know my dad raises beef cattle, but back home, that is something that he looked at for a little bit. Obviously, when feeder and fat prices started going down pretty good, he considered doing that a little bit. But even he looked into it and said, I know how to manage cattle and everything. I've done it my whole life. But just doing those heifers, he's like, it's a little bit more intensive than, you initially think of it. So that.
And heifers don't like being worked with.
No, they don't. So just a very general question. So for those that don't know, what's the best way to prevent mastitis? So
the best way to prevent mastitis, we'll start with milk cows, is to have good milking time hygiene.
Okay.
Post-dip those cows before they leave the milking parlor and pre-dip them before they start getting milked. Those two things are on average going to reduce the mastitis risk by 50%.
Okay.
And so when you start controlling it there, you're going to have less infections that could possibly spread to another animal.
Okay.
So you're just going to see improvements all the way around. Those are the biggest things. But overall, I'd say the National Mastitis Council's 5-point plan is really the go-to thing.
Okay.
If you have a mastitis problem, start with the basics and go there. Because the one thing I've learned through all the advents of technology, no matter what field it is in the dairy industry, if you understand the basics, you can very easily problem solve what needs to be done next. But if you get overly focused on the newest, latest, and greatest, you can sometimes forget the real core principles.
Very good point. So as far as pre-dip and post-dip, do you have, obviously every farm does it a little bit differently. Do you have a preference over either the order that you do things in or just whatever solution you would use for either post or pre-dip?
So I actually used to do a fair amount of research on teat disinfectants before I came here. For pre-milking teat disinfection, I have the preference also for post to dip instead of spray. In general, you're going to have better coverage and you're going to use less disinfectant. And if you're doing it correctly, it's going to take less time, because it actually does take a fair amount of time that most people don't realize to spray all sides of the teeth every single time. And that's usually something that just lacks there. So I remember reading this one publication that put some math behind it. And they said over the course of their study, they went through, I want to say it was almost 30% more teeth disinfectant in one instance versus another. So if they were spraying, they're using a third more. And so when you start putting the math behind that, on these large commercial dairies that order their disinfectant in 55-gallon drums, you could be ordering another one of those right then and there. So in terms of doing your milking time preparation for milking, if you just put the disinfectant on there and wipe it away and then attach after allowing it to sit on there for a period of time, that's best. Typically, you don't want to go back and strip after you've removed the disinfectant, because in essence, you're putting bacteria back on that teat end. So you typically don't want to do that. But in terms of post-milking teeth disinfection, I prefer dipping and do every quarter of every cow, even if it's blind. Just in case. But in terms of different germicides, the results of some of the work I've done, they're all going to work. They're all going to work. And as long as you focus on more of the core concept of this is covering the teeth the way it should be, and it's not overly harsh for the environmental conditions, you should be in good shape. But I would discourage homemaking of teeth disinfectants. Of all the chemistry that goes into making them at these commercial producers, they know what they're doing. You should capitalize on their expertise.
Is that just something that you've come across that people might do to try to cut corners cost-wise? They might try to mix up their own things that way?
Correct. A good example of this is something as simple as way back in the 70s, they were trying to improve the effect of iodine teeth disinfectants. And they said, you know what, we need to improve our teeth skin condition. So let's not put any water in the disinfectant. Let's just put oil and skin conditioners. Well, iodine needs water to work. And so what it did is it actually increased the risk of mastitis beyond what it would have been if there was no teeth disinfectant whatsoever.
Because it'll inflame it quite a bit, right?
And so it actually caused a lot more Staph aureus infections. And so with that, it just kind of reinforces the point of those folks that are usually selling those products have tested them to make sure that they are effective, well beyond the capabilities of any commercial producer out there today.
So was any of that related to your pre-doctoral fellowship, or was that kind of post through the USDA?
So my pre-doctoral fellowship, I actually received at Virginia Tech. And what that is it's a large grant that goes on to support the training and development of a scientist based on their project. So there's kind of a limited number of folks that get it just based on the competitiveness of it and the limited amount of grant dollars to go around. And so I was able to get that, and it would support the research that I was doing at that time, which was looking at how infections would impair memory growth and development was the core concept of that research that I did there. And I use that in the same research I do today.
Very cool. And then where do you see the dairy future of the dairy industry? Sorry about that. Whether there's new technologies coming up, new problems that are coming up with the technology, or just in general, and then as far as management practices.
That's the $1 million question. I think throughout all of the advent of new technologies, the core concepts still need to be appreciated. And the things that we've always been using to solve problems will always still be there, whether it's working with extension, working with your veterinarian, and having that discussion with all those people, and then relaying that to the commercial side of things, whether that's a pharmaceutical company to understand what problems are occurring out in the field. I think all of that will be super important as we move forward, especially with the continued consolidation with these smaller into larger farms. The other thing that I probably add to that is with the advent of all these new technologies, I'm kind of more of a reluctant person to always bite onto something new. I think the validation of those technologies before the widespread implementation is going to be really important too.
Okay.
Do these technologies do what we are told or think they are doing, or are they something else?
Okay.
So are they as accurate as they are so touted to be?
Right. Well, I appreciate you talking to me. That was the last question that I have. That's just a small tidbit of what you can expect on November 14th at Dairy Day at the Secrest Arboretum Welcome Center and Krauss Dairy in Worcester, Ohio. Thanks for listening.